peace talks become impossible overnight? Here's what really happened. Let me take you back to the morning of June 12, 2024. The headlines were Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland ends without Russia, diplomacy in tatters. The official story was that Moscow had once again rejected dialogue, that Putin was the intransigent aggressor, and that the West had no choice but to double down on military support for Kyiv. The White House issued a statement calling Russia's absence a clear sign of isolation. The New York Times ran an editorial lamenting the collapse of diplomacy. And within hours, the narrative had peace was impossible because Russia refused to negotiate in good faith. But here's the thing, I've spent the last 4 decades studying war, diplomacy, and the mechanics of great power conflict. I've advised generals, testified before Congress, and watched empires make the same mistakes over and over. And what I saw on June 12 wasn't just another failed peace summit. It was something far more: a deliberate, calculated breakdown in diplomacy, one that didn't happen by accident but by design. And if we don't understand why, we're sleepwalking into a war that no one can win. Let me tell you what really happened. The official what they want you to believe. The story goes like the Swiss Peace Conference was a noble effort to rally global support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Over 90 countries attended, including key U.S. allies, while Russia was conspicuously absent. The final communiqué reaffirmed the principles of the UN Charter, condemned Russia's invasion, and called for a just peace based on Ukraine's terms. The Biden administration hailed it as a united front against aggression. European leaders declared that Putin's refusal to engage proved he had no interest in peace, only conquest. The media played its part. CNN ran segments on how Russia was isolated on the world stage. The BBC interviewed Ukrainian officials who claimed that Moscow's absence was proof they feared diplomacy. Even some so-called realist analysts argued that Putin was too weak to negotiate, that he needed a battlefield victory to save face. The data seemed to support this. Polls showed that 60% of Americans still backed military aid to Ukraine. NATO had just announced a $100 billion fund for Kyiv. And the Pentagon had quietly shifted its messaging from helping Ukraine defend itself to weakening Russia permanently. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not just incomplete, it's actively misleading. Deconstructing what the media isn't telling you. Let's start with the most glaring: Russia didn't just wake up one morning and decide to boycott the summit. For months, Moscow had been signaling, publicly and privately, that it would only engage in talks if certain conditions were met. The most critical? That any negotiation had to include all parties to the conflict, meaning Ukraine and Russia, and that the discussion had to address security guarantees for both sides. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Swiss conference did neither. It was explicitly framed as a Ukrainian-led process, meaning Russia was excluded from the start. And the final communiqué? It demanded Russia's full withdrawal from all occupied territories, including Crimea, as a precondition for talks. In other words, the West wasn't offering negotiation. It was demanding surrender. But that's not all. Leaked diplomatic cables from early 2024 revealed that the US and its European allies actively discouraged Ukraine from pursuing back-channel talks with Russia. In one memo, a senior State Department official warned Kyiv that any unilateral negotiations would undermine Western unity and risk losing American support. Another document from the German Foreign Ministry suggested that Berlin would reconsider its aid packages if Ukraine pursued a separate peace. So let's be, this wasn't a failure of diplomacy. It was a rejection of diplomacy. And why? Because the real goal was never peace. It was victory at any cost. The hidden geopolitical why no one wants peace. To understand why, we have to out. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the end of the unipolar world order and the desperate struggle to preserve it. For 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it could dictate the rules of the international system. NATO action, regime change wars, economic sanctions, all tools of a hegemonic power that believed it could reshape the world in its image. But that era is over. Russia and China have made it they will not accept a global order where Washington sets the rules and everyone else follows. Now, here's the key: the Ukraine war is not just a conflict between Kyiv and Moscow. It's a proxy war between the US and Russia, and increasingly, between the US and China. Let's look at the 1. The US is not fighting for Ukraine's survival, it's fighting for NATO's dominance. If Washington truly wanted peace, it would have pushed for negotiations in 2022, when both sides were exhausted and a deal was on the table. Instead, the US and UK blocked the Istanbul talks, insisting that Ukraine keep fighting. Why? Because a negotiated settlement would have meant Russia retaining some territorial gains, and that was unacceptable to the West's strategic planners. 2. China is playing the long game. Beijing has positioned itself as a neutral mediator, but its actions tell a different story. Chinese arms sales to Russia have surged. Its state media amplifies Russian propaganda. And its recent peace plan was a masterstroke of diplomatic ambiguity, just vague enough to sound reasonable, but just specific enough to ensure no real concessions from Moscow. The message? China will not allow Russia to lose. 3. Europe is trapped. The EU's leaders know that a prolonged war is disastrous for their economies. But they're terrified of being seen as soft on Russia. So they keep sending weapons, keep imposing sanctions, and keep pretending that Ukraine can win without triggering a wider war. The result? A continent sleepwalking into economic collapse and military confrontation. And here's the most dangerous: no one in Washington is asking the hard questions. What happens if Ukraine loses? What happens if Russia escalates? What happens if China decides to arm Russia openly? The answer, as I've been warning for years, is a direct NATO-Russia war and possibly a nuclear exchange. The military: why the hawks are wrong. Now, let's talk about the battlefield. The Pentagon's latest assessments, leaked, of course, paint a grim picture. Ukraine's much-anticipated counteroffensive in 2023 failed. Russian forces have adapted. And despite billions in Western aid, Kyiv is running out of manpower, ammunition, and air defense systems. But here's what the armchair generals won't tell: Russia is not on the verge of collapse. Its economy has weathered sanctions better than expected. Its defense industry is producing artillery shells at a rate 7 times higher than Europe's. And its strategic depth means that even if Ukraine retakes some territory, Moscow can always fall back and regroup. Meanwhile, NATO is playing a dangerous game. The US has deployed long-range ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, allowing Kyiv to strike deep into Russian territory. The UK is training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s. And the Pentagon is quietly preparing for the possibility of direct NATO intervention if Russia breaks through Ukrainian lines. But let me be: this is not a video game. Every time the West escalates, Russia escalates in response. And unlike the US, Russia has no fear of nuclear war. In fact, it's counting on it. I've studied nuclear strategy for decades. And I can tell you, the moment NATO troops set foot in Ukraine, the risk of a tactical nuclear strike becomes real. And once the threshold is crossed, there's no going back. The domestic political: why no one in Washington wants peace. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the American politics. The Biden administration is in a bind. On one hand, public support for Ukraine is fading. A recent poll showed that only 30% of Americans want to keep sending unlimited aid. On the other hand, the White House can't afford to be seen as losing to Russia, not with an election looming. So what do? They double down. They frame the war as a moral crusade: democracy versus autocracy, good versus evil. They demonize anyone who questions the strategy as a Putin apologist. And they ensure that any talk of negotiation is politically toxic. But here's the dirty: the military-industrial complex loves this war. Lockheed Martin's stock is up 40% since 2022. Raytheon's profits have soared. And the Pentagon's budget? Higher than ever. Meanwhile, the American people are footing the bill. Inflation is still high. Infrastructure is crumbling. And the national debt? $35 trillion and climbing. But in Washington, no one cares. Because as long as the war continues, the money keeps flowing and the lobbyists keep winning. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this lead? Let's run through the possibilities. Scenario 1: The frozen conflict. Ukraine holds the line, but Russia digs in. The war becomes a permanent stalemate, like Korea in the 1950s. The US keeps sending aid, but the front lines barely move. Europe's economies stagnate. And the world moves on, except for the millions of Ukrainians and Russians who keep dying. Scenario 2: The escalation spiral. Ukraine's defenses collapse. Russia advances. NATO ICS and directly intervenes. A Russian missile hits a NATO supply depot in Poland. Article 5 is invoked. And suddenly, we're in World War III. Scenario 3: The Great Power Deal. The US finally accepts reality. It pushes Ukraine to negotiate. Russia keeps Crimea and the Donbass. Ukraine gets security guarantees, but not NATO membership. And the world breathes a sigh of relief. But here's the: none of these scenarios are good. The best we can hope for is Scenario 3, and even that requires Washington to admit defeat. The grand strategy: why America keeps losing. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. The United States is repeating the same mistakes it made in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. We believe in liberal hegemony, the idea that we can reshape the world in our image through military force and economic pressure. But the world has changed. Russia and China are not weak states that will bow to American demands. They have their own interests, their own alliances, and their own nuclear arsenals. And yet, Washington keeps acting as if it's still 1991. We EXD NATO right up to Russia's borders. We impose sanctions that hurt our own allies. We start wars we can't win. And we wonder why the world is turning against us. Here's the era of American dominance is over. The question is whether we'll accept that reality or keep fighting until we're bankrupt, isolated, and humiliated. What should we do instead? So what's the alternative? Realism. 1. Accept that Ukraine will not join NATO. It's time to stop pretending that NATO action is a viable strategy. The alliance is a relic of the Cold War, and its eastward march has only provoked Russia. 2. Push for a negotiated settlement. Not on Ukraine's terms, not on Russia's, but on realistic terms. That means territorial compromises, security guarantees, and a phased withdrawal of foreign forces. 3. End the economic war. Sanctions haven't worked. They've hurt Europe more than Russia. And they've pushed Moscow closer to Beijing. It's time to admit that economic coercion is a failed strategy. 4. Rebuild America. Instead of spending trillions on foreign wars, we should invest in our own infrastructure, our own people, and our own future. A strong America is one that leads by example, not by force. Now, I know this is controversial. The hawks will call me a defeatist. The neocons will say I'm appeasing Putin. But I've been warning about this for years. And I'll say it: the longer this war goes on, the worse it gets for everyone. The bottom-informed citizens are the only check on power. Let me leave you with: the greatest threat to American democracy isn't Russia or China. It's our own elites, politicians, generals, and media figures who would rather see the world burn than admit they were wrong. We are being lied to. Not by some grand conspiracy, but by a system that profits from war, that thrives on chaos, and that has no interest in peace. But here's the good: we don't have to accept it. Informed citizens, people who question the narrative, who demand accountability, who refuse to be manipulated, are the only brake on government overreach. So ask: do you want endless war? Or do you want a future where your children don't have to fear nuclear annihilation? The choice is ours. But we have to wake up before it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this war wasn't just some spontaneous eruption of Russian aggression, it was the predictable culmination of 30 years of Western strategic blunders. And I don't say that as some armchair historian. I was there. I saw it unfold in real time. In the 1990s, when I was serving in Europe, we had a chance to integrate Russia into a post-Cold War security architecture. Instead, we treated Moscow like a defeated enemy, exiting NATO right up to its borders while lecturing them about democracy. And when Putin, who, let's be honest, is no saint, warned us repeatedly that this would lead to war, we dismissed him as a thug. Well, now we're living with the consequences. Here's the uncomfortable: the United States has no coherent strategy in Ukraine. We're fighting a proxy war with no clear endgame, pouring billions into a conflict that's already drained our stockpiles, strained our alliances, and left us more vulnerable than when we started. Let me give you some numbers. Since 2022, the U.S. has sent over $175 billion in military and economic aid to Ukraine. That's more than the entire annual defense budget of most NATO members. And what do we have to show for it? A stalemate. A frozen conflict. A country that's been bombed back to the 19th century while our own military-industrial complex rakes in record profits. Now, I'm not saying Ukraine doesn't deserve our support. But there's a difference between support and delusion. The Biden administration keeps insisting that Ukraine can win, that Russia can be defeated, that Putin will collapse. That's not strategy, that's wishful thinking. And it's dangerous. Because while we're busy pretending this war can be won on the battlefield, we're ignoring the much bigger geopolitical shifts happening right under our noses. Let me explain why this matters. The war in Ukraine isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the global order. And right now, that order is unraveling. The US is overstretched, Europe is divided, and our adversaries are circling. China is watching. Iran is watching. North Korea is watching. They're all taking notes. And what they're seeing is an America that's too distracted by a peripheral conflict to focus on the real threats, like China's growing military power in the Pacific, or Iran's nuclear ambitions, or the fact that our own defense industrial base is too weak to sustain a major war. Take China, for example. Beijing has been the biggest beneficiary of this war. While we're busy arming Ukraine, China is extending its influence across the global south, forging new alliances, and positioning itself as the leader of an alternative world order. And let's not China and Russia are now closer than they've been in decades. In February 2022, just days before the invasion, Putin and Xi declared a no-limits partnership. Since then, trade between the two countries has surged. Russia is now China's top oil supplier, and Beijing is providing Moscow with everything from semiconductors to drones. This isn't just a temporary alignment. It's a strategic realignment. And we're doing nothing to counter it. Then there's Europe. The continent that once prided itself on its economic power and strategic autonomy is now a shadow of its former self. Germany, the engine of the European economy, is in recession. Its military is a joke after decades of underfunding. The Bundeswehr can't even field a single combat-ready division. France is distracted by domestic unrest. And the UK? Well, let's just say Brexit didn't exactly make them a global player. Meanwhile, Europe is dependent on American security guarantees, American energy, and American leadership. And what's our reward? A continent that's increasingly resentful of US dominance but too weak to do anything about it. Now, I know what the hawks will say. Nuclear war. Let me be clear. I'm not advocating for surrender. I'm advocating for sanity. The American people deserve a foreign policy that serves their interests, not the interests of defense contractors, think tank ideologues, and career politicians. We need a strategy that prioritizes our security, our prosperity, and our future. And right now, we don't have one. The question is, how much longer are we going to let this go on? How many more lives will be lost, how many more billions will be wasted, before we admit that this war is unwinnable? The establishment will never tell you that. They'll keep feeding you the same old lines: we must stand with Ukraine, Putin is Hitler, any compromise is appeasement. But here's they've been wrong about everything else. Why should we trust them now? The time for illusions is over. The time for realism is now. And if we don't act soon, we may not get another chance.